Let's talk about tomatoes. Welcome back to Sprung On Food. I'm your host, Kae Sprung. This season, we're talking about favorite foods, the history behind it, and the role it plays in the world today. Joining me today is award-winning bartender, co-founder of Speed, Rack Liquid creative director of Aplos, and partner and chief mixologist of DeLolo with Jennifer Lopez, Lynnette Marrero. Lynnette, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Very excited that you're here, and your favorite food is tomatoes. So very curious. I would love to learn about your relationship with this food and why it's your favorite.
I have to say, my relationship with this food started at quite a young age. I was the kid who would grab a tomato and eat it like an apple. There's always that story in everyone's family. My mom said that one time I ate so many tomatoes that I turned orange.
Is that right? Or was that just kind
She
of
said,
a cheeky
who
moment?
knows?
Oh.
She said I actually did, but you never know. But that's to me as a little kid running around eating them. And I've just always loved it as my whole life growing up. So they've been a part of every, meal, every occasion. And I think a greater appreciation, came for this food as I started to really understand it from a non-store bought item and really got into it as more of a heirloom variety and trying and tasting different ones and then learning how to, through CSAs, et cetera, and then growing our own. So a very long history with the tomato.
And did that all happen throughout your childhood, or was that a little bit later in life after you had already started to acquire such a passion and taste for this?
More later in life, as I kind of had head up to the Hudson Valley and was able to have access to, CSAs and farmer grown and more of that, there's different kinds. I mean, that's what I think I also love. We would get fresh ones from the market growing up, but they were more like the Jersey tomato, very different. And then you start getting into heirloom varieties and, investing your own money into, okay, I want to get, the things and pick them myself. And that's when I started seeing the beautiful variety and how many different ways you can enjoy this food. And, when you really think about it, you kind of don't notice and you're like, oh, well, the yellow ones are less acidic and different floral flavors and notes and things like that. So that's why I think I love this food so much.
Now, I know that you love eating it in its most pure form as it is, but are there other ways in particular where you think it really stands out in certain dishes that you like, or maybe unexpected ways that you like to incorporate it into certain meals or dishes?
Absolutely. I think what I love is kind of seeing the different ways. So cooked versus not cooked is a huge thing and how much you can do with the tomato uncooked as well. I started doing a lot of kind of infusing it into spirits and different ways of using it in cocktails. So obviously, since that's my profession, everything is like, well, how can I use it in a cocktail that's not a Bloody Mary, right? I think the Bloody Mary
Yeah.
is one of the more polarizing cocktails. Either people love it or hate it. I tend to love it because I love tomatoes, but I do understand viscosity can be a little thick for people and they're like, it's a heavy drink.
Okay.
It's one of those things. Every time we would go in through R&D with bartenders, I'm like, all right, if we're going to work on the Bloody Mary spec, and I would be like, I hate it. So I liked playing around with different ways to use it. So sometimes a lot of the ways, I was in Japan years ago and we were going for R&D and looking at, the different ways. And this one bar, he would just take these beautiful Japanese cherry tomatoes, gently press them and make a stirred cocktail. So he wasn't shaking the tomato in, he would press it. Then you had added the spirit and then stirred it and then strained it out. So you had more of the tomato water. So that's where I realized kind of the floral nature of the tomato and that you're able to kind of play with different liqueurs. So you can actually go sweet with it. You can go savory with it. So that's where I kind of realized a little bit more of the versatility.
When you did, I think a lot of people do often think of it as more of savory, and you just mentioned sweet. What would be an example of a sweet application that you might do with tomatoes?
Right. So jam. I think tomato jam is one of those kind of fascinating,
Aha.
delicious things you can do. And oftentimes I will look at how I'm using the complete tomatoes. So if I'm making sauce, I'm trying to get rid of the skins, and then I have the seeds separated out. And so then I want to take those skins and do something with them. So I puree those with a little bit of extra tomato water, and then you can make a nice jam out of them. So nice, because then I'm using kind of that nice, the skin has just a different flavor, note, and aroma. And then you're adding a little bit of maybe baking spices. I like to do my jam with honey. So I think because the
Ooh.
natural honey kind of really works with it better than just a plain sugar. And then you can have that. And then it's beautiful with cheeses. You can put it on a BLT with like, a little bit of the jam, adding that sweetness, and then maybe a really good quality bacon with the tomatoes. You're going to have that nice sweet savory combination.
Fabulous. Yeah, such versatility. Well, speaking of, to fully understand and appreciate our food, we've got to know where it came from. So
Absolutely.
today we're diving into the juicy tale of the tomato, one of the most versatile ingredients in our kitchen today. But as with any great story, there's more to this humble fruit than meets the eye. Our tomato story begins thousands of years ago in the Andean region of South America, around what we know now as Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. At that time, tomatoes were tiny, almost like berries, growing wild among the lush landscapes. Ancient indigenous peoples were the first to realize the potential of this wild plant. The Aztecs, in particular, were early cultivators of the tomatoes and even had a name for them, tomato, which means the swelling fruit. They didn't just eat them plain. They made inventive use of these tomato dishes alongside other crops like squash and chilies. In fact, these early recipes laid the foundation for Mexican cuisine as we know it today. Fast forward to the early 1500s. Spanish explorers arrived in Central and South America and encountered the bright red tomato for the first time. They were captivated by the taste, the color, and of course, the novelty. So, like any other New World food, such as potatoes, corn, and chocolate, they brought tomatoes back to Europe. But things didn't go exactly as planned. Lynnette, do you have any idea what might have happened?
Oh, I'm going to assume they're not taking root, not enough, soil is so important for growing them, moisture environment. So I'm assuming they just didn't take root.
I love your ecological approach. But unfortunately, Europeans were, let's say, just suspicious. They thought tomatoes were strange, even dangerous. You see, tomatoes are part of the nightshade family, which includes some toxic plants like belladonna. Europeans thought tomatoes might be poison apples, very Snow White of them, and they weren't completely wrong. Certain elements of the tomato plant, like leaves, can be harmful if ingested in large amounts. So for a while, tomatoes were mostly grown as ornamental plants. People just admired them in their gardens. There's even a rumor that aristocrats were the first to suspect tomatoes of being toxic because they'd eat them off fancy pewter plates. The tomatoes' acidity would react with the lead in the plates, causing them to leach lead, leading to lead poisoning symptoms. So, of course, they blamed the poor tomato instead of their dinnerware. But then the tomato got its lucky break. And where else but in Southern Europe? Italians, always adventurous with food, started experimenting with tomatoes by the late 1600s. They tossed them into sauces, cooked them with olive oil, and little by little, the tomato found its way into the heart of Italian cooking. Italians came to call it pomodoro, which means golden apple, probably because early tomatoes were more yellow than red. In France, the tomato also found fans and earned a new nickname, pomme d'amour, or love apple. It was said that tomatoes could work as an aphrodisiac, so the French were all ooh la la. Lynnette, what do you think about the Europeans finally accepting the tomato and how it exploded into their everyday cooking?
I think it's so funny because you really associate, modern times, those are probably the first foods people enjoy with tomatoes, right? Kids are going to have spaghetti sauce or pizza and places where you have that. So I think that that's a really interesting application of where you see it. And it is funny because, you do see how different it is used in different cuisines. I spent a lot of time in Peruvian restaurants. So it's interesting to see how the tomato is used in that culture and cuisine in a very different way.
Absolutely. Well, meanwhile, back across the Atlantic in colonial America, tomatoes still had a bit of a bad rap. People were skeptical until a guy named Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson from New Jersey decided he'd had enough of the slander. In the early 1800s, the tomato lover staged a public demonstration where he ate a whole basket of tomatoes on the courthouse steps to prove they weren't poisonous. And spoily, he survived. After that, tomatoes became much more popular in the US, and the reputation transformed from poison apple to essential crop in just a few decades. Lynnette, sounds like Colonel Johnson loved tomatoes just as much as you do. Would you ever do what he did to prove tomatoes' innocence?
I think I did as a child. I was like, how many can you test yourself with? But I think that's funny because then now you kind of realize where the Jersey tomato thing came from.
A tie back to your earlier sentiment. Yes.
Probably went back to it, and also maybe how the Garden State also got its moniker.
History doesn't lie. This is amazing. Yes. Now that we know how tomato traveled the world, let's talk about how it grows. If you're a gardener, you might know that tomatoes need warm, sunny environment to thrive. They're planted in late spring and really start to take off in summer. Tomatoes are climacteric fruits, meaning they grow to ripen even after they're picked. That's why a green tomato can turn red on your countertop. It's a little science magic. Lynnette, would you be able to guess how many varieties there are of tomatoes today?
I'm going to guess about probably 200 to 300 of them, just knowing what I've seen, the different varieties in red, yellow, size of them from, grape to cherry to larger to heirloom. So I can only imagine there's endless amounts.
Well, there are actually 10,000 varieties of tomatoes today. Some of the earliest varieties were small and round, like the wild ancestors in South America. But as tomatoes spread across the world, they were bred to develop unique shapes, sizes, colors, and flavors. Let's go through some of the tomato varieties. Don't worry, not all 10,000. Starting with the hefty beefsteak. These big, juicy tomatoes are perfect for slicing on sandwiches and burgers because of their size and firm texture. Then there's the Roma or plum tomato. Roma have a lower water content and are meatier, making them ideal for sauces, which is why they're a favorite for Italian cooking. In fact, a variety called San Marzano is the preferred tomato for many chefs when making classic Italian pasta sauces. And who can resist, as you mentioned, heirloom tomatoes? These beauties come in a rainbow of colors: yellow, purple, green, even striped. They're often sweeter and more nuanced in flavor thanks to generations of careful crossbreeding. Heirloom varieties are actually open-pollinated, meaning their seeds produce plants like their parent, unlike hybrid varieties that are often more uniform and predictable in appearance. And for those who love snacking on tomatoes, there are cherry and grape tomatoes. They're bite-sized, sweet, and great for salads, and their flavor packs a punch. Or if you're looking for something a little different, you might like Kamado. It's a hybrid tomato with a deep, dark color and slightly earthy, intense flavor. Lynnette, if you could rank your top 3 or even 5 for bonus points, what would your favorite tomatoes be?
So you kind of touched upon the different varieties that I love. So, this summer we planted in, I was looking at the ones I saved from the CSA. So we did San Marzanos and then an Amish paste, so which is in the paste family. And it kind of has it looks like a cross between a Roma, a little more heart shape, but in that same way of like a really good paste tomato where there's the nice juicy skin, a little bit, the seeds are just in like a little more pockets so you can take out. So you're making great sauce. Purple Cherokees, which are an heirloom variety that have kind of green on the top, and then the bottom turns from a red into a deep purple. And then striped Germans, which are, green striped on the top and are more of a yellowish green variety, even when they ripen. And then I would say in the cherry tomatoes, I'm a big fan of a few different kinds. Gin Fizz tomato, which is a kind of yellow with a little bit of red striping on it, and then a black cherry ones, which are going to be nice concentrated cherry tomatoes that, again, don't go super bright red, but they go into that more deep purple and they're nice and sweet.
First of all, loving the different names. And you taught me about varieties that did not come up in my research just yet. I mean, I could keep diving more into tomatoes, and I might after this, just to find more interesting names. If you could name a tomato, what would you name it?
Oh, I think I would find one. So I had one in Madrid recently, and it was different from the other ones that I had. There was this bright red, almost the size, it seemed like a beefsteak, but it was much more juicy and a softer texture, even though it's so big. And I would just probably call that one the corazon, the nice big heart, because it had that beautiful red and juicy. And they would just, the way they would cut it, you just have it so simply with just a little bit of olive oil and salt. And it would just come to the table like this massive platter of like almost like sliced beef heart or something.
I love it. Can we petition to make that happen? Ah,
We
I love it.
should.
Fabulous. Oh, well, whether you call it the corazon, a tomato, pomodoro, or pom d'amour, the tomato has come a long way from its days as a misunderstood berry in the Andes. From decorative garden plant to one of the most essential ingredients in global cuisine, the tomato has won over taste buds around the world. And the best part? Each tomato on your plate has its own story. Maybe it's an heirloom variety with a unique lineage, or a hybrid designed for that perfect balance of sweet and tangy. Either way, the tomato is a reminder that the world's greatest flavors often come with a fascinating history. So, Lynnette, what do you think of the backstory of the tomato?
I love it because it actually goes into a lot of, when you hear about the backstory of it, it actually makes a lot of sense of where you see the flavors going now. So I find, when I was looking at recipes from different bartenders, I started seeing a lot of bartenders using tomatoes in mezcal cocktails. So if you think about its origin of coming, really taking root in Mexico ancestrally, and then that would make sense that those things would complement each other. So that idea of grows together, goes together. So that makes sense. And I think what I love about hearing it too of traveling and then how people embraced it in different ways, it makes sense that it kind of traveled in so many ways. I love that it was so controversial at first. That would be because it would ruin me if I couldn't have tomatoes. So I'm like, what? So many things, but it makes a lot of sense too of like how not understanding how some fruits would go. I look at a lot of how the way you use the leaves, they are very useful when you're growing the tomatoes to take the leaves on their own. You can take them and soak them, put them in water, and then spray that back on your plants, and it becomes a natural insecticide, basically, to keep the bugs away. So that's kind of a natural way that it protects itself. So when you're picking the leaves, so that's just one way of thinking about how it kind of what it was doing. Right? There's just so many ways to really appreciate this technically fruit, not vegetable.
Right. I was about to say when you mentioned that a lot of people tend to, I mean, there are so many different varieties of produce that get commonly miscategorized just because I think we're just used to it. And so we just keep saying it, but in fact, something is not in one category and it is in another. And tomato is one of those where it is technically a fruit, but we've just put it into the vegetable category, I guess, because most commonly the uses that we get out of it, people just say it's friends with vegetables, but you're here to say, no, it is, for one, and most importantly, a fruit, but it can also be used in that sweet application and really bring out that sweetness that it naturally has. To let it say, hey guys, I'm actually a fruit. Well, with a food with such historic presence, you can bet it's shown up in pop culture. One of the most recognizable uses of tomatoes in pop culture today is the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes. Since its founding in 1998, Rotten Tomatoes has become a go-to site for movies and TV reviews where fresh and rotten ratings determine whether the film has won over critics and audiences. The site's name refers to an old vaudeville and theater tradition of throwing actual Rotten Tomatoes at performers who weren't entertaining, a classic expression of disapproval. Then we have the cult classic Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. It's a B-movie horror comedy about, you guessed it, killer tomatoes attacking humanity. This intentionally campy film parodied horror tropes and inspired an animated TV show in the 1990s. In the 1920s and 30s, tomato was used as slang in American English. It was used to refer to an attractive woman. The term can be found in novels and music from that era. Although outdated, the slang gave rise to funny cultural nods in shows and movies referencing the 1920s, including gangster films like The Godfather and comedy sketches where 1920s lingo is used ironically. About the song, Homegrown Tomatoes. This 1983 country song by Guy Clark is a heartfelt ode to the joys of homegrown tomatoes, with lyrics like, "Only two things that money can't buy, and that's true love and homegrown tomatoes." In the 2002 Japanese Game Boy Advanced RPG Tomato Adventure, the plot revolves around a world filled with anthropomorphic tomato characters. And of course, we have Spain's famous La Tomatina Festival in Buñol, a real-life pop culture phenomenon. Every year, thousands gather to throw tomatoes at one another in a massive food fight, creating a sea of red pulp that looks like a scene from a surrealist movie. Lynnette, have you been to this festival?
I have not been to that festival, but it's going to be high on my list now.
Now, would it be sort of blasphemy because you love tomatoes so much, but they're used in a non-edible way?
Yeah, I think there's something fun about that. I mean, why not? It gives it the kind of cult status.
Hmm.
So I think that's fine. I like, obviously, hopefully they're using the ones that maybe fell or were imperfect or, weren't able to use. Although I don't believe in perfection of fruit, unless it's, has something that you can't eat it, then fine. But, just because something has a weird shape, which is why I love the heirlooms, they grow all funky ways. But no, I love kind of finding the ways that tomatoes are honored, right? If someone throws any sort of festival, clearly then there's some sort of deep love for it as well.
Yes, and if you go and you make it there, I'm sure you will find your people too. Tomato
Exactly.
lovers in some capacity. Maybe it's not their wealth of knowledge and eating habits are not to the same degree. They at least love them in some capacity.
I have like I said earlier, I'm like, I try to use every part of that tomato. So even when I'm making, either deciding to go with a tomato paste or I'm cooking it down more, so it's more concentrated, a little sweeter, sometimes I'll just, especially like a lot of it's preserving. There's nothing sadder than after the tomato season when you don't have fresh anymore. And so then there's the idea of, how do you preserve them best? So, I've taken to this year, we're doing a lot of freezing of some of the fresh tomatoes. So that way, like most of the cherry ones, because they don't have quite as much water. And then they're being able to throw those into fresh pastas or sauces or things this winter, besides then also taking the sauces and putting it together with other complementary herbs. So it grows like the reason why tomato basil makes sense. They are complementary growers together. The basil plants help to weather, again, other bugs away from your beautiful tomatoes. So it makes sense that you mix those together and you have that beautiful combination of flavors that works so well. And then that becomes this nice little flavor bomb that you could throw into stews and sauces over the winter. And then canning and jarring and pickling or all those other ways. I've been thinking a lot about with some of the green ones, doing a little bit of a fermentation to try and go with some of the fermented style rather than like a salt-based pickling to see how that will change some of them. That's were a few things I was reading about. There's some people like to do a fermented tomato sauce. I want to see how kind of the yeast kind of will change the flavor and what you'll get out of that when it's going to be more in that fermentation sort of way, the natural lacto fermentation.
Oh, I'm so intrigued. Yes, I want to know about this too. We are uncovering so many new trend forecasting situations here that I didn't know about. So this is fabulous. When it comes to freezing, as you mentioned, are there any best practices of ways to freeze the tomatoes to ensure that they will just not have, maybe that freezer burn flavor afterwards?
I mean, the first thing you do is kind of do a nice flash freeze. So you wash them, let them dry off so there's not water on the outside freezing to them. So you can skim a nice little, we just use a nice little, like a teaspoon of vinegar and water. Best way to clean them off, let them dry. Then put them for a quick, maybe 30 minutes in a single layer in a metal tray in the freezer. Pull them out, then put them into a nice sealable bag. I use the silicone bags that have kind of a nice seal so I can push out as much air as possible. Seal those up and then pop them back in the freezer for their full finish. And they tend to come out pretty great. They're not super, they don't have a lot of freezer burn. Or I do it, like I said earlier, taking them and putting them into, making them in a sauce and then making them a sauce cube. So putting them in, again, silicone trays that you would use for baking. So you have these nice little kind of flavor cube bombs. So again, doing those, getting them to a point. Those I'll leave for usually about 2 hours at first, pull them out, put them in a bag, get all the air out and let them continue to freeze. So that way you have those and they're great because those go into soups and stews and things. With those fresh tomatoes, that's the trick. You can also do like a light roasting on them before and then put, with like maybe onions or garlic and olive oil, some salt, and then take that in more of a confit way and then put that in a tray, put it in the freezer, pull it out. So then you're going to have more flavors and aromas already introduced, but it's all about getting that air out of the bag and then just use them within the season. So you want to make sure you're like plan it out and use them before the next harvest.
These are such fabulous tips. Do you have a tomato hack cookbook coming out anytime soon? Because
no, I don't, but I'm really
I will
looking forward
vouch
to
for
reading
you.
whoever writes their book because I, always looking for new ways to do it. And then, next season, playing around with growing different ones.
Lynnette, thank you so much for sharing your love of tomatoes and helping me share its story.
Absolutely. Like, don't be afraid, play around with the tomato. It'll come back. I think there's also the last kind of bit of advice I'll say is if you're still seeing any tomatoes out in farmers markets, you can also make them as shrubs. And shrubs are always a great way of kind of macerating that flavor into with some vinegar so it becomes a little fruited. And then you can use that in different applications, over the course of the winter. But that's always a nice way of playing around with preservation in a drink form.
Lynnette, this book needs to happen, and I'm campaigning for you to do it. So we'll put that out there into the universe. Your tomato book coming soon. Lynnette, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. You can find links and more info in the description below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. See you next time.